Lesson 11, multiplying and dividing real numbers. First, we need to review some properties of real numbers working with multiplication. The multiplication property of -1 just means anything times a -1 is always going to be the opposite of the answer. So an example, 9 times a -1 is a -9. But if it was a -9 times a -1, it would actually be a positive 9. The negative times a negative is always positive. Multiplication property of 0, anything times 0 is 0. And the inverse property of multiplication, think reciprocal. So the inverse of 9 is 1/9, and 1/9 times 9 is always equal to 1. When you're using the inverse property of multiplication, the answer, the product is always 1. And then reviewing multiplying sign numbers, a positive times a positive is always positive. Negative times a negative is always positive. A negative times a positive is negative. So the only way to get a negative answer is if one of the factors is negative. So let's take a look at some examples. 4 times a -8 is a -32. -6 times a -0.7. A -6 times a -0.7 would give you a positive 4.2. The next one, parentheses, a -3 and parentheses raised to the 4th power would give you a positive 81. Now this next one looks the same. The only difference, there is no parentheses. So in this case, you have to multiply, it's going to be a -1 times 3 to the 4th. 3 to the 4th is 81 times a -1 equals a -81. So if there is no parentheses and there's an exponent involved with it, and there's a negative in front, your answer is always going to be negative. Okay? And then the last one here, 9 times a -0.8. 9 times 8 is 72, but I have 0.8. So it should be a -7.2. Other examples, we got -12 times a -2.5 give us an answer of positive 30. Negative times a negative is a positive. And we have a -5 raised to the 4th power gives you an answer of -625. Again, there is no parentheses, so our answer is going to be negative. Next one, -2 to the 5th power. 2 to the 5th power is 32 times a -1 equals a -32. Then we have parentheses, -4. Because the -4 is on the inside of the parentheses and the exponent's on the outside, now I have to raise -4 to the 3rd power. So that's -4 times -4 times -4, which gives you a -64. And then we have a -8 in parentheses raised to the 4th power. That would give us a positive 4,096. Now some of you might think, why is the previous one negative and the last one a positive? When you're working with negatives in parentheses and you're raising it to an odd number, your answer is always going to be negative. If you have negative in parentheses and you're raising it to an even number, it's going to be positive. Now, property of real numbers with division. They're very similar as multiplication. It's same signs, it's always positive. If they're different signs, the answer is negative. So if we take 105 and divide that by a -7, my answer has to be negative because different signs. You would have a -15. A -2/3 divided by a -3/4. When you divide fractions, you're really multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of a -3/4 is a -4/3. Now I can multiply straight across. -2 times -4 is +8. 3 times 3 is a +9. So I have an answer of 8/9. Next, we have a -4/5. divided by a negative 9/10. So I'm really multiplying by the reciprocal, which is negative 10/9. And I can do some simplifying first. I can divide a 5 here and get 1. Divide a 5 out of negative 10, and I get a negative 2. Now I multiply straight across. Negative 4 times a negative 2, positive 8. 1 times 9 is 9, and I get a positive 8/9. And the last example here, 3/8 divided by a negative 3/4 or multiplied by a negative 4/3. I can simplify here. Negative 3 cancels out of 3, so now I have 1/8 times a negative 4 over 1. I can also divide a 4 here, and I get 2. Divide a negative 4 here, or divide by a 4 there, I get a negative 1. So now I have 1 times a negative 1, which is negative 1. 2 times 1 is just 2, so I have an answer of negative half. Take a look at an application. The Veronia Cave in Abkhazia, Georgia is the deepest known cave in the world. At an elevation of negative 2,140 meters, Veronia is a challenge for experienced cavers. If it takes 8 days to travel to the bottom of the cave, what is the average number of meters the cavers would travel each day? So we take the total elevation, which is negative 2,140, and we have to divide that by 8 days to see what is the average number of meters somebody would have to travel. So we know the answer is going to be negative because we have a negative and a positive. 8 goes into 21 2 times. 8 times 2 is 16. I subtract down here. So I have negative 21 minus 16 gives us a negative 37. Bring down the 4. Actually, it would be a positive 16 because we're multiplying 8 times a negative 2. Okay, so a negative 2 would be a positive 16. So if I add them, it gives you a negative 5, 4. 8 goes into 54. Be going 6 times. So 8 times a negative 20. 8 times a negative 6 would give you a negative 48. But if we're subtracting a negative 48, we're really adding 48. So a negative 54 plus 48 would give you a negative 6. Bring down the 0. 8 goes into 60. Be about 7 times. 8 times a negative 7 is a negative 56. And if we were to do the subtraction, it would be 4. So really it would be negative 267.5 meters per day. And the last one. During a cold spell in January 1989, Homer, Alaska recorded a low temperature of negative 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The city of Bethel, Alaska recorded a low temperature twice as cold as the low in Homer. What was the temperature in Bethel, Alaska? So if it was twice as much as a negative 24, twice means I multiply that by 2, which would give us a temperature of a negative 48 degrees